Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and I'm going to devote a few presentations to the strategies and tactics adopted in World War I. Whilst understandably trench warfare dominates our images of World War I, this is a partial and misleading picture of the war. The war opened with armies on the march, and though stalemate was the result on the Western Front, the Entente powers deployed their weak point strategy in 1915, and 1916 was the year of great attacks, with more of the same in 1917. And though it looked as if they weren't, lessons were in fact being learnt all the time, and by both sides, until in 1918 the British, French and American armies applied the culmination of those lessons in all-arms battle, to devastating effect. Now, in this presentation I'm going to focus on the Western Front in 1914, with all the armies, as I said, on the march, and with the British Army hurrying over to France. In what came to be known as the Battle of the Frontiers, the Germans put the Schlieffen Plan into operation, with 6,000 trains moving 1.5 million men, plus their equipment, plus the artillery, into carefully planned positions, whilst the French put their Plan 17 into operation, with its primary aim of holding the Germans whilst regaining Alsace and Lorraine. The Germans positioned 7 armies against the French, from the north, where Germany bordered Belgium, to the Ardennes region further south, and with 2 armies defending Alsace and Lorraine. The French had placed their 5 armies in the northeast of France, running along the Belgian, Luxembourg and German borders, ready to defend their territory and retake Alsace and Lorraine. But the key thing to note is that this was a war of manoeuvre, with armies largely on the attack. The Schlieffen Plan was for the German 1st and 2nd armies to push through Belgium. Originally, they were also going to go through part of southern Holland too, but this was dropped, really because of political reasons, before turning south to take Paris. Its 3rd, 4th and 5th armies would do the same, but from a more direct route through the Ardennes, which included Luxembourg, approaching Paris from the east. In this way, not only would Paris be taken, but the French armies attacking Alsace and Lorraine would be encircled and trapped between the armies taking Paris and those facing the French attack. The French Plan 17 set out to cover the German thrust after it had passed through Belgium, whilst attacking to retake Alsace and Lorraine. The French advanced into Alsace and Lorraine with 3 armies. The Germans moved back, so sucking the French in and stretching the gaps between their armies, hitting them with their artillery in the process. Once the Germans attacked, the French were pushed back, executing a tactical retreat so as not to be encircled. It was worse in the Ardennes, where the Germans cut the French in their bright red and blue uniforms to pieces, using spotter planes to target the French artillery too. The French tactics showed their lack of preparedness as much as their uniforms did. There was a lack of command at every level. Artillery was either too close or too far behind the infantry, and there was often no liaison between the two. Bayonet charges only led to more slaughter. No surprise then that the French retreated in near total chaos. However, things didn't go to plan for the Germans either. It was essential that they take the fortresses protecting Liège quickly, but the Germans met fierce resistance from the Belgians, and the forts held out for almost 2 crucially important weeks. The Germans were also slowed down by the French, who brought troops from the failed assault in Alsace and Lorraine, and the British played their part too. Still, by early September, with German advances across the line of its 1st to 5th armies, and the German 6th and 7th armies comfortably holding the French forces in Alsace and Lorraine, Helmut von Moltke, the German commander-in-chief, felt able to boast that in 6 weeks all this will be over. But Moltke's changes to the Schlieffen Plan, which I'm sure you know about, now had its effect. It was bound to. Moltke only had 60% of his available manpower, when the plan had envisaged 90% as necessary. The First Army had to cover some 500 kilometres in just 3 weeks. That's an average of 25 kilometres a day, with heavy packs on their backs, and whilst fighting their way through Belgium and into France. Supplies couldn't keep up, and communications were very difficult too. It resulted in the German First Army losing touch with both headquarters and the Second Army to its left or east. What's more, Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, formed a 6th Army to face the German First Army. The decisive battle would be on the River Marne, and it was a desperate affair. It was nothing less than a battle to save France. The Germans threw 1.25 million men against 1 million French and the 125,000 British force. Joffre's leadership at this point was a critical factor. So too was his acceptance of tactical mistakes and his ability to correct them. Infantry and artillery were better coordinated. Infantry spared as much as possible. Artillery used as much as possible. Flanks were better protected, and territory gained made secure so that it could be defended against German counterattacks. Attacks needed strength in numbers, as well as maximum artillery fire. Strong, clear and decisive leadership was also essential, and Joffre dismissed generals who he felt were not up to the challenge. And so the Germans were pushed back, establishing a strong defensive position above the River Aisne. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. For Germany, Moltke was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn as commander-in-chief. Moltke went off to have a nervous breakdown, and new strategies had to be worked out. Both sides now tried to find a way round each other's armies, and there was only a narrow gap to exploit between their current positions and the French coast. So began the race to the sea. The ports of Boulogne, Dunkirk and Calais were crucial strategic points if more British forces and supplies were to be landed, or stopped from landing. The Belgian ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge, too, for the war at sea, whilst the railway junctions were also strategic targets. In October, the Germans went back through Belgium, taking Antwerp, Ghent, Bruges and Zeebrugge and Ostend, before being thwarted by the Belgians when they flooded the River Weser. Antwerp, like Liège earlier, had put up a vital stubborn resistance that bought the Entente forces time to get into position in Flanders. It was another desperate affair, with railways used to the limit in order to get to key locations before the enemy. It again ended in stalemate, though not before a second key battle, the First Battle of Ypres. The Entente forces showed that they had quickly learned from the mistakes made in the Battle of the Frontiers, and were not pushed back. It ended without either side making any significant gain, but it meant Germany had lost the race to the sea. In these first desperate months of war, up to January 1915, the Germans, fighting on two fronts, had suffered somewhere between 650,000 and 800,000 casualties, killed, wounded or missing. The French had 1 million casualties, 20% of France's total number of casualties had been suffered in these first months of the war, while the small British expeditionary force was all but wiped out. As winter approached, both sides accepted that their forces were too exhausted to continue. Total stalemate had been reached, and both sides literally dug in, and from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, a distance of some 650 kilometres, it was clear that it would be no temporary phenomenon. Now, this is nothing more than a brief overview. I have about a dozen pages of my notes covering 1914. If you want them, email me at historymadeeasier@gmail.com and I'll send them to you. Obviously, I think they're very useful. And as I've said in other presentations, this is not a scam. You won't hear from me again. I'm just happy to help. As it is, I hope what I've been able to squeeze in here has been useful for you. Thanks so much for listening, and the best of luck with your studies. Cheers.